Hello, my name is Tilika Jain, and today I'm here with Dame Barbara Stocking, who is the former CEO of Oxfam and current president of the Murray Edwards College in Cambridge. So to begin with, my first few questions just relate to some of your general views on the role of aid in parts of the developing world. So there have been many arguments about the effectiveness of aid, with it being argued that it can create dependency and foster corruption. However, a report published by Global Justice Now stated that more wealth is actually leaving the continent of Africa in terms of profit repatriation, tax dodging, and loan repayments than is entering in terms of aid and loans. So given that despite aid, wealth is actually leaving the continent, do you think that aid is truly effective?
Well, I think there's two parts to that. There's one part is that you really only want to use aid for really building up the underpinning systems, the infrastructure. And I don't mean just physical, I mean education, health, agricultural support that will allow a country to develop, and that you can't have the country develop without them. You can't have that without your children being educated and so on. But of course, what you want to do is to make sure that people then do get into the economy and are able to deliver. So there's a great need for, obviously, for trade and for enterprise and for engagement of companies to really promote economic development. That's one part of it. The second part about money leaving the continent is a slightly separate one, really. We do need people to, from the continent itself, to make sure that they do invest in the continent, and that and that investment is very important, partly because a lot of the people more locally will know where the investment best goes. So that's almost a separate problem. You add it up and say there's more coming out than going in, but actually they're quite different things that are happening.
Right, yeah, because the aid goes into particular areas,
yes,
and the money that's coming out is for from corporations and taxes.
Yeah.
And
but
stuff.
we need it to stay in country, no doubt, and we need companies to pay taxes in those countries, particularly if they're multinationals. They should be paying the taxes in those countries themselves.
Right, okay. You've also stated that in the face of climate change, the excessive resource-intensive lifestyles of the Western world are extremely unsustainable, and that they might actually hinder development in these poorer regions. So the Western world also played a role in establishing extractive colonial institutions in the past. So what is your opinion of the notion that aid should be renamed reparations that are owed to these parts of the world for the costs of climate change, colonial history, slavery, yes, things like that?
Well, there's a lot of truth in that word, but the trouble is, if you want to bring about change, do you go about really using that type of word to press people into doing it? It is much easier. I think you have to persuade the developed world that it is their responsibility, because we have been the ones who've caused the climate change. Reparations feels a bit, I don't know, a denigration really in some ways. But yes, being responsible and making sure they pick up that responsibility, even that is very hard, I think. And obviously in the climate negotiations, that's been a very big part of the discussions, how to get enough money in to deal with the adaptation that's needed in the poorest countries. And I don't think we've persuaded our publics about that either. I don't think they understand that. At least our publics in the north are beginning to understand that climate change is actually happening, but I don't think they've much idea about how badly it's affecting poor people.
Right, so do you think in terms of the administration, do they look at the aid that goes to these parts of the world as a responsibility or as benevolence?
I don't know, I think different people will see that very much. I think historically it's been much more the benevolent view, doing good to poor people and not sort of seeing it as a responsibility. But the world is changing. We're seeing ourselves as much more global and realising that the problems in one place, don't just sit there, they come around the world. And I think that's the part of it, to say that we are all in this world together, and therefore we can't have poor people living the way they do, because it will have repercussions in its own way, and it's in our interest, and it isn't just benevolence.
Right, yeah. In your speech, you also spoke about direct cash transfers and how it enables people to help themselves, and you spoke of your experience in Bangladesh. Yeah. So I thought that was quite relevant to microfinance, which is sort of based on the same principles, and actually Bangladesh did see the birth of the microfinance revolution with the Grameen Bank. So how do you compare microfinance to direct cash transfers in terms of effectiveness?
Okay, well I think they're different purposes. So direct cash is often given in situations of emergency where people have no money and no ability to do anything, and it's much more like a welfare payment, just to actually to cope, to get the food and all the rest of it. You can move on from that to saying, well, even after an emergency, never mind just in general development, you can give money that is loans in order to get people going again. Now, one of the issues, certainly in emergencies, is care in not giving people loans when they've got nothing anyway, they've just lost everything. Can you really expect them to actually pay back a loan very easily? But of course, microfinance generally is more in situations where you're more stable and have a chance for development. I think microfinance has been fantastic, but in some cases, as you know, there is debate because it's been overdone and putting people into a lot of debt and so on that they can't pay. But equally, there's another part that I think is really important that we were working on very much in Oxfam, which is microfinance is okay, but for, say, an individual family or a community, each of them with their own bit of loan. But what you often need is bigger chunks of money loaned in order that, say, a cooperative can produce its grain store, or they can buy the frozen truck to get the goods to market or whatever, or a warehouse or some sort of small factory. And for those you need bigger sums. And one of the biggest problems in the developing countries is they can't get loans at that bigger level, say $100,000 or more, to do something substantial where you can really make a business take off. So again, sometimes microfinance can be good because it's kept that family surviving and it's got a bit of extra money in for the education, all good, but it's not actually really building up into something that's economic, that will grow into a business and be sustainable. We need that as well.
Right, which is interesting because some of the primary objectives of microfinance is to foster business and entrepreneurship. So it's interesting to see how that's actually playing out.
Yeah.
So now my questions will be more focused on leadership and especially the role of women in leadership positions. So you've been heading huge multi-regional organizations for many years now, and you stated that while there isn't much outright discrimination, you have encountered a lack of respect from many men. So in your experience, does this kind of relationship actually hinder the functioning of these organizations?
It depends which one. Certainly in terms of Oxfam, I had a really very mixed experience because surprisingly, being a woman in developing countries was very helpful. The reason was I was really denoted as the honorary man. In the sense that they had to meet, people in that country had to meet with me because I was the chief executive. You had no choice. And so in those cases, it was very helpful as well to be a woman because I used to get to meet the women as well as often the powerful men, which was lovely because women actually know a lot about what's going on in the communities. You learn an awful lot. So in that sense, it was surprisingly good. But of course, it's places like Davos and so on, where you're patted on the head for being a woman and from an NGO. And then that's really annoying because you can't get the work done that you're trying to do as a leader of the organisation. But on the whole, I think with Oxfam, a woman's leadership was quite good. First of all, there wasn't an internal fight about it. Oxfam had appointed me because for a long time they had been very concerned about women because 70% of the world's population of poor people are women and girls. And they were just practicing what they preach. So it was accepted in the organisation. So I didn't have any internal strife to deal with. But that presentation to the outside world and people who didn't really want to take it on, and if they didn't like Oxfam messages, then they particularly wouldn't like it coming from a woman either. Right. But sometimes you can, again, there are ways that the different sexes have different ways of dealing with things, and sometimes you can be more helpful because there isn't so much testosterone. I mean, again, I could meet a big chief exec of a major company that we were having an argument with, and another man from Oxfam, and it would have probably turned into a row. But also equally at those times I don't mean I was flirting, but I do mean I was being charming and nice about it, and it actually made some meetings easier. So it's quite interesting to use both of the sexes in the organisation.
Okay, so you've also spoken about representation in leadership bodies such as parliaments, and you have stated your support for gender quotas. So, however, do you think that the issue of a lack of respect and consideration could still exist in these situations, perhaps because they might not be seen, they would be seen as less qualified than their male counterparts because they needed a quota to get where they are?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to representation, like parliaments, I absolutely think there is no reason to be 50-50, because there's no special particular skills that you need in, you know, to represent your community and represent the ideas of that community. So I don't think that's a problem at all, frankly. It's not to say that women get treated equally when they're in, and that may be a bit of a problem, that men will say, well, you only got in because of a quota, but I think we should just fight for that and say, you know, this is rubbish. You know, there's 50% women in the world, you know, in all those sort of decision-making places, we want women. I think it's a bit different, and I don't think I would go for quotas yet, anyway, in sort of organisations and businesses, because then you do need particular skills, and you will get rubbished if you haven't got the, you know, the development and the experience to do that. So there's a bit of a difference there, but yeah, Parliament definitely.
Okay, that's nice. So now just to like summarize, what are some key points that you wanted the delegates to take from your speech at the summit today?
That leadership of an NGO like Oxfam, first of all, is absolutely fantastic experience. And it has, I think, even greater than places like the private sector, challenges and dilemmas in the countries it operates, enormous challenges to the ways you think and the way you do things, the cultures of those countries. I mean, it is both very challenging, but it's such an enormous pleasure to be working and grappling with all those issues that I hope I'm not trying to persuade them to go into an NGO, but to understand just how complex working in the developing world through an NGO like that is, and both to encourage some of them in it, but to encourage many others to have more respect for people who are working in those agencies. Even charities in the UK have very complex problems often that are really, and the private sector can often sort of feel like, well, it's just trivial, it's a charity. It's not like that at all.
Yeah, especially like that story you shared about the actual conflict that Oxfam faced, where they placed like a bomb because of the women working.
Yes.
It was quite eye-opening
Yes.
to see that these kind of things actually happen to humanitarian work.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me. It's been great. Thank you.